What begins as a routine morning of field preparation on a struggling heritage farm transforms into an extraordinary historical discovery when dedicated farmer Sarah Mitchell's old tractor blade strikes a mysterious metal box, setting off a chain of events that bring Smithsonian historians rushing to her rural property and uncovers secret letters from George Washington that challenge our understanding of American history and connect her modest farmland to pivotal moments in the founding of our nation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Mitchell had always believed that perseverance and honest work would eventually yield rewards. Her 110-acre farm, nestled in the rolling hills of Western Virginia, had been in her family since 1802. Each generation proudly passing down not just the land, but the principles of determination and integrity that had sustained the Mitchells through civil war, economic depressions, and devastating droughts. The weathered wooden barn still displayed the hand-carved initials of her great-grandfather Ezekiel, who had rebuilt it following a terrible storm in 1919. The stone wall that marked the eastern boundary had been carefully assembled by her grandmother during the challenging years of the Dust Bowl, when crop prices barely covered basic necessities. The row of magnificent maple trees that lined the lengthy gravel driveway had been planted by her father as a wedding gift to her mother, a living testament now standing tall and strong, providing shade to the modest two-story farmhouse Sarah now called home. But the past decade had been increasingly difficult for Sarah. Corporate agriculture had transformed farming from a family-centered way of life into a high-stakes business requiring massive capital investment and economies of scale that small operations like hers simply couldn't achieve. Climate change had brought unpredictable weather patterns, just as her operating expenses soared to unprecedented levels. The devastating floods of 2023 had destroyed her soybean crop, leaving fields of rotting plants not worth harvesting, while unusual late frosts in 2024 had decimated her apple orchard just as the trees were beginning to bloom. At 47, Sarah faced the crushing reality that she might be the Mitchell who finally lost the family legacy. Her desk drawer contained a growing collection of foreclosure notices from Piedmont Agricultural Bank, each letter more threatening than the last. The second mortgage she had taken out to replace the failing irrigation system now loomed over her like a dark cloud. Every morning Sarah woke at 5:15 a.m. with the same gnawing anxiety, calculating and recalculating diminishing options for keeping the farm solvent for just one more season. Her kitchen table, where 5 generations of Mitchells had shared meals, celebrated harvests, and weathered hardships, had become command central for financial triage, spreadsheets, and calculator. Loan statements and deferral requests all spread out beneath the warm glow of the vintage copper pendant light her grandmother had installed decades earlier. The numbers never improved, no matter how creatively she arranged them. The Mitchell farm was less than 6 months from foreclosure. The farmers market in Oak Ridge, where her family had once proudly displayed their premium organic produce, had gradually become a painful reminder of her declining fortunes. Her regular customers had slowly migrated to other vendors as her crop diversity diminished and her once vibrant stand shrank to a humble table, offering whatever limited harvest she could manage with minimal help. The neighboring vendors, many of whom had known her family for decades, greeted her with sympathy poorly disguised as casual conversation. Sarah's most faithful companion through these difficult years was her young border collie, Maple. At 3 years old, the dog was energetic and intelligent, her black and white coat gleaming with health despite the farm's challenges. Maple had been a gift from Sarah's brother on her birthday, and the dog had quickly become an exceptional working partner, instinctively understanding how to move livestock and patrol the farm's boundaries. Now she mainly kept Sarah company during long work days, offering silent solidarity when the burden of failing finances became almost too heavy to bear. Recently, however, Maple had developed an unusual fixation with the West Meadow, 20 acres of gently sloping land that had historically been used for wheat, but had lain fallow for the past 2 seasons due to Sarah's inability to afford adequate seed and fertilizer. The field bordered Sycamore Creek, a modest stream that swelled during spring rains, but typically reduced to a gentle trickle by midsummer. For days now, Maple had been disappearing for hours, returning to the farmhouse with muddy paws and an unusual intensity in her eyes. When Sarah investigated, she discovered the dog had been digging persistently in a specific section of the West Meadow, creating a pattern of holes that seemed oddly deliberate. Sarah initially attributed this to typical dog behavior, perhaps. Maple had detected a groundhog colony or was following the scent of deer that frequently crossed the property. But the dog's persistence and the strange focused pattern of her digging suggested something different. Whenever Sarah called her away from the area, Maple would reluctantly obey, but her body language conveyed unmistakable frustration, as if Sarah were interrupting vital work. This behavior was completely out of character for the well-trained, typically obedient dog. The early summer of 2025 had brought unusually mild temperatures to Western Virginia, allowing Sarah to begin preparing her fields earlier than normal. This rare stroke of good fortune had given her a glimmer of hope. Perhaps with perfect weather conditions, she could maximize her limited resources and produce enough yield to at least make the next mortgage payment. With this desperate optimism, Sarah had risen before dawn on a clear Tuesday morning in early June, determined to begin turning over the West Meadow to prepare it for a late-season crop. After a quick breakfast of strong black coffee and homemade bread with honey from her 2 remaining beehives, she headed to the equipment shed where her father's 1987 International Harvester tractor waited. The machine was decades past its prime, held together with improvised repairs, spare parts salvaged from farm auctions, and the mechanical knowledge Sarah had inherited from her father. Maple, sensing adventure, insisted on accompanying Sarah, her excitement unusually pronounced as they approached the West Meadow. The dog trotted ahead, repeatedly circling back to ensure Sarah was following, then leading her toward the specific area that had captured her attention for days. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What's got you so worked up, girl? Sarah asked as she climbed into the tractor's seat. We've turned this field dozens of times. Maple barked sharply, an unusual sound from the typically quiet dog, and resumed her focused circling of one particular section near the eastern edge of the field. Sarah started the tractor, the engine protesting briefly before settling into a familiar rumble. She began the methodical process of turning the soil, creating neat furrows across the field while Maple paced anxiously nearby. The morning progressed steadily, the rich soil turning over to reveal its dark promise. The familiar rhythm of the work momentarily allowed Sarah to forget her financial worries. As the sun climbed higher, Sarah approached the section that had so captivated Maple's attention. The dog became increasingly agitated, barking and running alongside the tractor with remarkable energy. Sarah had just begun to worry about the dog overexerting herself when she felt a jarring impact through the tractor's frame. The blade had struck something solid, sending a metallic clang through the morning air. The tractor shuddered, and the engine strained against the unexpected obstacle. Sarah immediately disengaged the blade and shut down the engine, concerned she might have hit a buried pipe or piece of old farm equipment forgotten by previous generations. Maple was already at the spot where the blade had struck, pawing excitedly at the freshly turned earth and whining with unusual intensity. "Easy, Maple," she soothed as she approached. "Let's see what's got you so worked up." Kneeling in the soft soil, Sarah began carefully clearing away dirt from around the object. Her fingers soon made contact with something distinctly unnatural, A smooth, flat surface with a peculiar texture, unlike any metal she had ever touched. As she excavated more soil, the outline of what appeared to be a rectangular box began to emerge, approximately 14 inches long and perhaps 10 inches wide. The object was clearly manufactured, not a natural formation, but it had an unusual appearance that Sarah couldn't immediately place. It wasn't rusted iron like abandoned farm equipment might be, nor was it plastic or any common modern material. Instead, it had a distinctive patina and weight that suggested aged metal, possibly brass or copper, with a greenish oxidation that spoke of great age. What in the world? Sarah murmured as she cleared more soil away. The object appeared to have intricate patterns on its surface, though they were partially obscured by compacted dirt. What had initially seemed like random textures gradually revealed themselves to be deliberate engravings, elegant scrollwork that framed what appeared to be an insignia or seal of some kind. Most curious of all was the presence of a simple but substantial latch mechanism that suggested the box was designed to be opened, its contents protected and preserved. Maple whined and pawed gently at the object, her earlier frantic energy now transformed into focused interest. The dog's behavior struck Sarah as almost reverential, as if she somehow understood the significance of what they'd discovered. With growing excitement mixed with uncertainty, Sarah carefully extracted the box from its earthen tomb. It was surprisingly heavy for its size, suggesting it might contain something substantial. The craftsmanship became more apparent as she brushed away centuries of accumulated soil. Whoever had created this had employed skilled artisanship, the detailed engraving speaking of a time when such work was done entirely by hand. "This is something special, Maple," Sarah said, her voice hushed with wonder. "This isn't just some old junk." For a brief, tantalizing moment, Sarah allowed herself to imagine that she'd discovered some historical artifact, perhaps a jewelry box or document case from the colonial era. Such a find could potentially attract interest from historians or collectors. But the unique appearance and obvious age of the object suggested something potentially more significant than simple monetary value. Sarah carried the box back to the farmhouse, Maple trotting proudly beside her as if fully aware of her role in the discovery. In the kitchen, Sarah gently placed the object on a clean towel spread across the table and began the delicate process of cleaning it more thoroughly with a soft brush and minimal water. As layers of soil were carefully removed, the extraordinary nature of the artifact became increasingly apparent. The box was made of what appeared to be copper with brass reinforcements at the corners, but with a distinctive patina that spoke of great age. The surface was covered with intricate engravings, including what Sarah now recognized as a variation of the Great Seal of the United States, but with subtle differences from the modern version. Around the edges ran a delicate pattern of 13 stars, representing the original colonies. The most remarkable feature was an inscription engraved on the top: General Washington's private correspondence, to remain sealed until Providence guides its discovery. Below this was a date, Anno Domini 1797, the final year of Washington's presidency. After nearly an hour of gentle cleaning and examination, Sarah reached for her phone and called the history department at Oak Ridge Community College, where her cousin's husband, Dr. Michael Chun, taught American Revolutionary history. If anyone would know who to contact about such an unusual discovery, it would be him. "Michael?" "It's Sarah Mitchell," she said when he answered. "I need your advice about something unusual I just found while turning over the West Meadow." "Old farm equipment from your great-grandfather's day?" he asked, familiar with the random mechanical parts that occasionally surfaced on old family farms. "No, nothing like that," Sarah replied. "It's some kind of metal box, looks very old. It has engravings, including what looks like the Great Seal. And, Michael, it has an inscription mentioning General Washington and a date -1797. There." Was a moment of silence before Michael responded, his academic interest clearly piqued. "Can you send me some photos?" Sarah quickly took several detailed pictures of the box from multiple angles and texted them to him. The response was almost immediate. His phone rang less than a minute after sending the images. Sarah Michael's voice had changed completely, now carrying an unmistakable edge of excitement and disbelief. "Where exactly did you find this?" "Near the eastern edge of the West Meadow, maybe 50 yards from Sycamore Creek," she answered, surprised by his intensity. "Maple's been trying to dig there for days." "Don't try to open it," he instructed firmly. "Don't even attempt to clean the latch mechanism. I'm going to make some calls. That box, Sarah. The design, the insignia, the date, and the inscription. They all align with genuine artifacts from Washington's time. This could be historically significant." "Historically significant?" Sarah echoed, confused. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that based on my preliminary visual assessment, this appears to be a genuine 18th century document case, possibly connected directly to George Washington himself. The craftsmanship matches known examples from that period, and the modified Great Seal was sometimes used on Washington's personal items. I need to contact some colleagues at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History immediately." The implication took a moment to sink in. Sarah had assumed the box might be some interesting antique or local historical curiosity. The suggestion that it could be connected to the first president of the United States seemed almost impossible. "I'll call you back within the hour," Michael promised before ending the call. While waiting, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, staring at the mysterious box with newfound wonder. Maple settled contentedly at her feet, occasionally glancing up at the artifact as if pleased with her role in its discovery. The financial worries that had dominated Sarah's thoughts just hours earlier temporarily receded, replaced by curiosity about how such an object had come to be buried in her family's field. True to his word, Michael called back 40 minutes later, his voice barely containing his excitement. "Sarah, the Smithsonian's preliminary analysis of your photos has created quite a stir. Dr. Eleanor Washington Lewis, head of the Presidential Artifacts Division, is assembling a team to come to your farm immediately. They should arrive within a few hours." "That was fast," Sarah remarked, surprised by the urgency. "Because what you found might be extraordinary," Michael explained. The box design and insignia match examples known to have been commissioned by Washington himself for his most private papers. The inscription references Providence guiding its discovery, which aligns with Washington's well-documented belief in divine providence. This could be a deliberately buried cache of Washington's personal papers, something historians have speculated about for centuries. "On our farm?" Sarah asked incredulously. "Wouldn't someone have noticed something unusual before now?" "Not necessarily," Michael explained. "Your family has owned this land for just over 2 centuries. This box could have been buried in 1797, 5 years before your ancestors acquired the property. Modern farming equipment wouldn't necessarily have detected it unless directly striking it. Plus, the West Meadow borders Sycamore Creek, which suggests it could have been deliberately placed near a water source as a landmark." After ending the call, Sarah found herself looking at her family farm with new eyes. The land she had always known as the Mitchell Farm had clearly held secrets that predated her family's arrival by years. The fields she had walked thousands of times suddenly seemed alive with hidden mysteries, stories buried beneath the soil she had taken for granted. By early afternoon, a convoy of vehicles turned into her driveway, 2 official Smithsonian vans, a mobile preservation laboratory, truck, and several personal vehicles. Sarah watched from her porch as a diverse group of individuals emerged, carrying specialized equipment and moving with the focused energy of professionals responding to a significant event. A tall woman with silver-streaked black hair and wire-rimmed glasses approached the house first, extending her hand as she introduced herself. "Miss Mitchell?" I'm Dr. Eleanor Washington Lewis, Director of Presidential Artifacts at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. Thank you for reporting your find so responsibly. Many people would have attempted to open such an object or sell it before contacting proper authorities. Sarah shook her hand, somewhat overwhelmed by the sudden transformation of her quiet farm into a hive of historical activity. I figured someone should look at it before I did anything. I never expected all this. Dr. Washington Lewis smiled. But based on the photographs, what you've discovered could be one of the most significant historical finds related to our first president in over a century. We needed to respond accordingly. She introduced her team, conservation specialists, historical document experts, 18th century metallurgists, and several specialists in fields Sarah had never even heard of. Each carried an air of barely contained excitement beneath their professional demeanor. "May we see the box?" Dr. Washington Lewis asked. Sarah led them into her kitchen, where the artifact still rested on the table. The reaction from the assembled experts was immediate and dramatic, a collective intake of breath, followed by an almost reverent silence as they gathered around the table. "Extraordinary," Dr. Washington Lewis whispered, pulling on thin specialized gloves before gently rotating the box for a better view of its engravings. "The craftsmanship is consistent with the highest quality American silversmithing of the late 18th century. The modified Great Seal matches examples known to have been used on Washington's personal items, and the inscription's calligraphy is consistent with formal engravings of the period." One of the specialists carefully photographed the box from multiple angles, while another set up specialized scanning equipment. A third expert took environmental readings from the air surrounding the artifact, while a fourth prepared a sterile containment unit. "Ms. Mitchell, would you show us exactly where this was found?" Dr. Washington Lewis asked. "The context of discovery is extremely important for proper documentation." Sarah led a subset of the team to the West Meadow while others remained at the farmhouse to continue examining the box. Maple accompanied them, her demeanor unusually dignified, as if understanding the importance of the occasion. At the discovery site, the historians carefully marked the precise location with GPS coordinates and began a systematic survey of the surrounding area. "We'll need to conduct a proper historical assessment of this section of your property, Dr. Washington Lewis explained. "Based on this discovery, there's a possibility that additional material may be present below the surface." "What does that mean for my farm operations?" Sarah asked, suddenly concerned about how this might impact her already precarious financial situation. Dr. Washington Lewis regarded her thoughtfully. "It would mean temporary restrictions on agricultural activity in specific areas while we conduct proper surveys and possible excavations." Noticing her expression, she added, "There would be compensation for any disruption to your farming activities." "Ms. Mitchell, additionally, significant historical discoveries often qualify for various preservation grants and historical designations that can be financially beneficial to landowners." As they walked back toward the farmhouse, one of the archaeologists jogged up to join them, her expression animated with excitement. "Dr. Washington Lewis, the ground-penetrating radar is showing multiple anomalies within a 20-yard radius of the discovery site. Definitely not natural formations. They appear to be regularly spaced and consistent with potential buried objects of similar size to the box." The information clearly excited Dr. Washington Lewis, though she maintained professional composure. "Let's complete the preliminary survey before drawing conclusions, but make sure the imaging team documents everything thoroughly." Back at the farmhouse, the atmosphere had transformed from careful examination to barely contained excitement. The scientific team had been using specialized equipment to examine the box without damaging it, including a type of X-ray imaging technology that could visualize the internal contents without opening the container. "Ms. Mitchell," one of the specialists said as they returned, we've completed preliminary analysis of the internal composition. Would you like to be the first to see what's inside the box you discovered?" Sarah nodded, suddenly feeling a strange connection to this mysterious artifact that had lain hidden beneath her family's land for who knows how long. The specialist turned her laptop screen to show Sarah a remarkably clear three-dimensional rendering of the box's interior. Inside was an organized arrangement of what appeared to be folded documents, several small objects that might be seals or medallions, and what looked like a bound journal or ledger. "Are those letters?" Sarah asked, pointing to the neatly stacked papers. "Yes, and they appear to be intact," Dr. Washington Lewis confirmed, her voice hushed with wonder. "Based on the imaging results, these appear to be handwritten documents from the late 18th century, preserved in remarkable condition thanks to the box's watertight design. The paper composition and ink patterns are consistent with documents from Washington's era." One of her colleagues, a specialist in historical documents, nodded in agreement. The folding patterns match the formal correspondence style of the period. Several documents appear to bear wax seals consistent with those used by high-ranking officials of the early Republic. As the experts continued their analysis, the significance of Sarah's discovery became increasingly apparent. What she had uncovered wasn't simply an interesting historical curiosity. It was potentially a transformative find that could provide new insights into America's founding era and its first president. "Ms. Mitchell," Dr. Washington Lewis said finally, turning from a hushed conversation with several colleagues, "based on our preliminary assessment, what you've discovered appears to be a deliberate time capsule created during Washington's lifetime, possibly at his direct instruction. The contents suggest a collection of private correspondence, personal reflections, and possibly sealed communications never intended for his contemporaries." She paused, allowing the information to sink in before continuing. "With your permission, we would like to transport the box to our secure conservation facility for proper analysis and study. Additionally, we would like to conduct a systematic historical survey of the discovery area, which would require temporary restrictions on agricultural use of that specific section of your property." Sarah considered the request, her mind still processing the extraordinary turn of events. Just hours earlier, she had been a struggling farmer facing foreclosure. Now she stood in her kitchen surrounded by Smithsonian historians who viewed her land not as failing acreage, but as a potential treasure trove of American history. "What exactly would this mean for my farm going forward?" she asked carefully. Dr. Washington Lewis gestured for her to join her at the kitchen table, her manner shifting from scientific excitement to practical consideration. "Ms. Mitchell, discoveries of this significance typically initiate several processes. First, your property, or at least the relevant portions of it, would likely be designated as a site of historical importance. This designation comes with certain restrictions, but also significant benefits." She outlined how sites of extraordinary historical significance often qualified for various preservation grants, tax benefits, and heritage funds that could provide financial stability while maintaining private ownership. Additionally, she explained that compensation would be provided for any areas temporarily removed from agricultural production during the historical assessment. Beyond the immediate financial considerations, she continued, sites of extraordinary historical significance often became educational resources and even tourism destinations, creating new economic opportunities for landowners willing to partner in their preservation and presentation. As the conversation continued, Sarah began to see possibilities she hadn't considered before, ways this unexpected discovery might not only save her family farm, but transform it into something that honored both her family's agricultural legacy and the much older connection to America's founding that had just been revealed. By evening, the initial documentation of the box and preliminary survey of the discovery site had been completed. The team prepared to transport the artifact to the Smithsonian Secure Conservation Facility, where it would undergo more detailed analysis and proper study. Before they departed, Dr. Washington Lewis approached Sarah with formal paperwork acknowledging her discovery and outlining the next steps in the process. "We'll be in touch tomorrow to schedule the comprehensive historical survey," she explained. "In the meantime, our legal team will prepare documentation regarding site designation and landowner compensation for your review." As the convoy of vehicles departed down her driveway, Sarah stood on her porch with Maple leaning against her. Both watching as the sun set over fields that suddenly held new meaning. The land that had been in her family for 5 generations had apparently been hiding evidence of America's earliest days, potentially containing letters and documents from George Washington himself that had remained sealed and preserved for over 2 centuries. The financial worries that had seemed so crushing that morning hadn't disappeared, but they had been transformed by this unexpected development. For the first time in years, Sarah felt something beyond anxiety when she looked at her farm, a spark of possibility, of purpose beyond mere survival. Inside, she settled at her kitchen table, the same table, where she had spent countless nights agonizing over bills and bank notices. Tonight, however, she opened her laptop to research George Washington's connections to Virginia and the historical significance of 1797. Eager to understand more about the implications of her discovery and what it might mean for the future of her land and perhaps American history itself. Maple curled contentedly at her feet, occasionally glancing up with what Sarah could have sworn was satisfaction. The young dog had somehow known what lay beneath the soil of the West Meadow, had persistently tried to reveal it, and had ultimately succeeded in changing everything. "You knew all along, didn't you, girl?" Sarah murmured, reaching down to scratch behind Maple's ears. The dog sighed contentedly in response, her mission mysteriously accomplished. As midnight approached, Sarah finally closed her laptop, her mind buzzing with new information and possibilities. Tomorrow would bring more experts, more assessments, and the beginning of what Dr. Washington Lewis had called a comprehensive re-evaluation of Washington's final years in office and his vision for the young republic. For Sarah Mitchell, it would also bring something she hadn't dared hope for just one day earlier, a new path forward for the family farm, one that might preserve not just her family's legacy, but connect them to something far more profound and historically significant. She glanced at the foreclosure notices still stacked on the corner of her desk. Their power to terrify her suddenly diminished. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would be different from the desperate struggle she had faced that morning. Something extraordinary had been hiding beneath her fields all along, waiting for the right moment to emerge. As Sarah finally prepared for bed, exhausted but too excited to feel it, she realized that in uncovering the Washington box, she had discovered something else as well: hope. Buried like historical treasure beneath the weight of years, suddenly unearthed and gleaming with possibility. Looking out her bedroom window at the star-filled sky, Sarah wondered for the first time not about crop prices or bank payments, but about George Washington himself, what messages he had sealed away in that copper box, what insights or warnings, or wisdom he had preserved, and whether he had ever imagined the struggling farmer and her faithful dog, who would someday uncover his legacy on a small patch of Virginia soil. Sarah awoke before her alarm the next morning, her mind already racing with thoughts of the previous day's extraordinary events. For the first time in years, she hadn't spent the pre-dawn hours calculating financial scenarios or worrying about impending bank deadlines. Instead, her thoughts had been consumed by images of George Washington, the mysterious copper box, and the secrets it might contain about America's founding. Maple, sensing her master's unusual energy, abandoned her customary morning laziness and followed Sarah downstairs with unexpected vigor. The young border collie's renewed vitality seemed directly connected to discovery, as if completing. Her mission had reinvigorated her. "You've earned extra breakfast today, my clever girl," Sarah told her. adding an additional scoop of premium kibble to Maple's bowl. The border collie's tail wagged appreciatively before she settled into her meal. Over her own breakfast of strong coffee and fresh toast with homemade blackberry jam, Sarah reviewed the information Dr. Washington Lewis had provided before departing. The Smithsonian team would return at 9 a.m. to begin a comprehensive survey of the West Meadow and surrounding areas. They would use advanced technologies including ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry to identify any additional historical materials without disturbing the soil until absolutely necessary. Sarah had already signed preliminary paperwork, granting permission for the survey while retaining her rights as the property owner. Dr. Washington Lewis had been refreshingly transparent about both the historical importance of her discovery and her legal rights throughout the process. As she waited for the historical team to arrive, Sarah found herself drawn back to the spot where she discovered the box. The morning sun cast long shadows across the partially turned field, highlighting the contours of the land in ways she'd never fully appreciated before. How many mornings had she worked this soil without realizing what lay beneath? How many generations of Mitchells had unknowingly walked above the buried remnants of America's founding era? Standing in the quiet morning light, Sarah felt a profound shift in her relationship with the land. What she had always valued primarily as agricultural real estate, acres to be planted, harvested, and converted into financial sustenance, now revealed itself as something far more complex. This wasn't just Mitchell land. It was ground that had witnessed something extraordinary, had held secrets that potentially predated her family's ownership by years. A vehicle turning into her driveway interrupted her contemplation. To her surprise, it wasn't one of the Smithsonian vans but Michael Chun's modest hybrid sedan. He emerged looking both excited and slightly disheveled, as if he'd dressed in a hurry. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted as he approached, his academic composure temporarily replaced by unrestrained enthusiasm. "After I got home last night, I spent hours researching Washington's activities in 1797. Sarah, do you realize what's happening here?" She smiled at his excitement. "I'm starting to get some idea." Dr. Washington Lewis seemed to think it was significant. Michael laughed. "Significant is the understatement of the century. The box's design and that specific inscription match. Descriptions in a letter from Washington to Alexander Hamilton that historians have long debated. Washington mentioned creating a secure repository for certain correspondences too, sensitive for present eyes but too important for destruction. Scholars have argued for generations about whether this referred to actual documents or was merely metaphorical. He fell into step beside her as they walked the perimeter of the West Meadow, his historian's perspective bringing new dimensions to land Sarah had known all her life. "This location makes perfect sense," he continued, gesturing toward Sycamore Creek. In 1797, this area was part of a larger property owned by Washington's nephew. Historical records show Washington visited here several times during the final years of his presidency and after his retirement. What's truly fascinating is that this visit coincided with the height of factional tensions between Federalists and Democratic Republicans, when Washington was growing increasingly concerned about threats to the fragile new republic. But why would Washington bury private papers on someone else's property? Sarah asked. "That's exactly what makes this discovery so potentially revolutionary," Michael explained. Washington was deeply concerned about his papers being misused or misinterpreted after his death. He spent his final years sorting his correspondence. But historians have long suspected he may have separated out his most sensitive writings, particularly those that might inflame the partisan divisions he feared could tear apart the young nation. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Washington Lewis and her team, now expanded to include additional specialists and equipment. The historical activity soon transformed the quiet farm into a hive of methodical investigation. Teams deployed across the West Meadow with various instruments, establishing a precise grid system for documentation and gradually building a subsurface map of the area surrounding the discovery site. Dr. Washington Lewis approached Sarah and Michael, tablet in hand, her professional demeanor unable to completely mask her excitement. "Ms. Mitchell, the preliminary survey results are remarkable. We've identified what appears to be a distributed pattern of similar objects beneath your field. They form a precise geometric arrangement consistent with an intentional burial of multiple document cases. The mathematical precision of their placement suggests this was a carefully planned deposit, not a hasty concealment." She turned the tablet to show them a composite image generated from the ground-penetrating radar data, ghostly outlines beneath the soil that clearly indicated deliberate, organized placement of multiple boxes similar to the one Sarah had discovered. "Based on the distribution pattern and our initial assessment of the first box, we're looking at what appears to be a sophisticated time capsule system, not just an isolated artifact. This wasn't something accidentally left behind. It was deliberately placed here as part of a larger historical record." "How many boxes are we talking about?" Sarah asked, trying to visualize her familiar farm terrain occupied by a hidden cache of founding-era documents. "It's too early for precise estimates," Dr. Washington Lewis cautioned, "but the preliminary data suggests a network of approximately 7 to 9 individual containers arranged in a pattern radiating from a central point. The box you discovered appears to be one node in this larger system." As the morning progressed, the survey revealed increasingly compelling evidence of the historical cache that had been deliberately installed on what would later become Mitchell farmland. The historical team identified what appeared to be a central repository buried deeper than the surrounding boxes, along with what Dr. Washington Lewis described as marker stones that might have once served as navigational references for anyone seeking to recover the documents. By mid-afternoon, Dr. Washington Lewis called a meeting with Sarah to discuss the preliminary findings and next steps. They gathered under the shade of the ancient maple trees near the farmhouse, the contrast between the trees planted by Sarah's father and the much older historical artifacts now being uncovered, creating a striking temporal perspective. "Ms. Mitchell," Dr. Washington Lewis began, "based on today's survey, we'd like to propose a phased historical investigation of the site. This would involve careful extraction of selected containers for detailed study, followed by a more comprehensive documentation of the entire network if warranted by initial findings." She presented a detailed map showing proposed excavation areas and a timeline extending over several months. "We understand this would impact your agricultural use of this portion of your property, so we've prepared an initial compensation proposal based on standard rates for historical access to private land." The document she handed Sarah outlined a monthly payment structure that nearly took her breath away. The proposed compensation for temporary historical use of approximately 5 acres would cover her mortgage payments with money to spare, and this was just the beginning of potential financial arrangements if the site proved as significant as preliminary evidence suggested. Additionally, Dr. Washington Lewis continued, "Given the apparent significance of this discovery, I've initiated discussion with several foundations that specialize in supporting American heritage preservation on private land. There are substantial grants available for landowners who partner in preserving important historical sites, while maintaining ownership and appropriate use of their property." Sarah studied the documents, a strange mixture of emotions washing over her. The immediate financial relief was undeniable. These arrangements would forestall the looming foreclosure and provide stability she hadn't dared hope for just days earlier. Yet there was something more profound happening, something that transcended mere financial salvation. Her relationship with this land was transforming before her eyes, deepening in ways she couldn't have anticipated. "How would this affect my farming operations long term?" she asked, thinking practically even as her mind grappled with larger implications. That would largely depend on what we find and on your preferences as the landowner, Dr. Washington Lewis explained. In similar cases, we've established arrangements where portions of properties are preserved for their historical significance, while other areas continue in agricultural use. Many landowners find that the combination of preservation grants, educational program income, and focused agriculture actually improves their financial stability while allowing them to maintain their connection to the land. As the historical team continued their survey work, local media began arriving at the farm. Alerted to the potential significance of the discovery, Dr. Washington Lewis had anticipated this interest and provided Sarah with guidance on handling press inquiries, emphasizing the preliminary nature of the findings while acknowledging the potentially groundbreaking implications. The first reporter to arrive was Jason Thompson from the Oak Ridge Gazette, a respected local journalist known for his thoughtful coverage of community issues. Sarah had known Jason for years. He had previously written about the challenges facing small family farms in the region, including a sympathetic profile of the Mitchell farm's struggle against corporate agriculture. "Sarah," he greeted her warmly, "when I heard about a potential Washington discovery at your farm, I never imagined something of this magnitude. Dr. Washington Lewis tells me this could rewrite our understanding of the founding era." Sarah appreciated his direct approach. "It's still sinking in, Jason. Yesterday I was just trying to prepare my field for planting. Today I'm learning that my family's farm might be one of the most important historical sites in the country." He conducted a thorough interview, asking thoughtful questions about both the discovery itself and how it might impact her farming operation. Unlike some of the reporters who arrived later, Jason seemed to understand that this wasn't just a history story. It was about a family farm at a crossroads, suddenly presented with an unexpected new path forward. By evening, the preliminary survey had been completed, and the historical team prepared to depart with plans to return the following day to begin careful extraction of one of the secondary boxes for detailed analysis. Before leaving, Dr. Washington Lewis provided Sarah with updates on the artifact she had discovered. "The conservation team has completed the initial analysis of the box," she explained, showing Sarah detailed imaging renderings that revealed the incredible preservation of the documents. "Inside, what we're seeing is extraordinary. The watertight design has preserved the paper and ink in remarkable condition. The documents appear to include personal correspondence between Washington and several key figures of the early Republic, including John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, and Thomas Jefferson. When would more concrete information be available about the contents?" Sarah asked, fascinated by the glimpses of the historical documents. "We're consulting with specialists in 18th century handwriting and paper conservation," Dr. Washington Lewis explained. "The most remarkable aspect is that preliminary dating suggests these letters were written during Washington's final years, a period when he was increasingly concerned about partisan divisions threatening the new nation. Several documents appear to bear his personal seal, suggesting these were his own copies rather than those sent to recipients." After the historical team departed, Sarah found herself alone on her porch with Maple, watching as the setting sun painted her fields with golden light. The farm looked outwardly unchanged, the same rolling acres. Her family had worked for generations, yet everything had fundamentally shifted. Beneath the familiar surface lay an unexpected connection to America's founding era, a legacy far older than the Mitchell family's presence. Her phone rang, interrupting her contemplation. The screen displayed Piedmont Agricultural Bank, the very institution whose foreclosure notices had haunted her for months. With a deep breath, Sarah answered, expecting another difficult conversation about her overdue payments. "Ms. Mitchell," the familiar voice of Regional Manager David Porter greeted her. "I understand congratulations are in order. Your farm has become quite newsworthy today." "News travels fast," Sarah replied cautiously. "Indeed it does." I'm calling because this development obviously affects our ongoing discussions about your mortgage situation. We'd like to schedule a meeting to explore how these changed circumstances might allow for restructuring your current obligations." The conversation that followed represented a dramatic shift from their previous interactions. Rather than pressure and deadlines, Porter spoke of flexibility, partnership, and the bank's desire to support historically significant properties in the community. The underlying message was clear: foreclosing on a farm that had suddenly become potentially central to understanding America's founding era would be a public relations disaster for the bank. They were now eager to find accommodating solutions. After ending the call, Sarah couldn't help but laugh at the ironic turn of events. For years, she had struggled against faceless financial institutions that viewed her family legacy as nothing more than collateral on a troubled loan. Now, the discovery of Washington's hidden documents beneath her fields had suddenly transformed her bargaining position. The bank that had been preparing to take her land was now practically begging to renegotiate terms in her favor. That evening, several of Sarah's neighbors stopped by, drawn by the news reports and genuine concern about what the discovery might mean for one of the oldest farming families in the community, instead of the isolated struggle she had endured. For years, Sarah found herself surrounded by support and shared excitement. Frank Wilson, whose orchard bordered the northern edge of the Mitchell property, brought homemade apple cider from his wife and stayed for coffee. At 82, Frank represented an older generation of farmers who had witnessed dramatic changes in rural Virginia. "In all my years," Frank remarked, shaking his head in wonder, "I never imagined something like this happening in our little community. George Washington's own papers, right under our feet, and nobody knew it until your dog started digging." Maple, hearing herself referenced, thumped her tail against the floor from her position near Sarah's chair. "Makes you think, doesn't it?" Frank continued, his weathered face thoughtful. "We work this land, worry about rainfall and crop prices and bank loans, thinking we understand our place in the world. Then something like this comes along and reminds us we're just the latest in a long line of people who've connected with this ground beneath our feet." His words resonated deeply with Sarah, articulating the perspective shift she'd been experiencing since the moment the tractor struck the copper box. The other visitors expressed similar sentiments, their conversation extending late into the evening as they helped Sarah process the implications of her discovery. When she finally retired to bed, exhausted but unable to quiet her mind, Sarah found herself reaching for an old family album she hadn't opened in years. By the dim light of her bedside lamp, she paged through photographs of Mitchell's working the same fields across decades, her father on the very tractor Sarah still used, her grandfather with horse-drawn equipment before that, and faded sepia images of her great-great-grandfather clearing stones from newly claimed farmland. Each generation had known the land in a slightly different way, had faced unique challenges in maintaining the family legacy. Now Sarah found herself at a juncture her ancestors could never have imagined, custodian not just of the Mitchell farming tradition but of what might be America's most tangible connection to George Washington's private thoughts about the nation he helped create. The realization brought a profound sense of responsibility, but also a strange comfort. The land had been important long before her family arrived, and would likely continue to hold significance long after her own stewardship ended. Her role was temporary but meaningful, a bridge between past and future, with obligations to both. The next morning dawned clear and cool, perfect conditions for the historical team to begin their careful extraction of one of the secondary boxes identified in the previous day's survey. They arrived early, equipment ready and permission secured. Through the expedited process Dr. Washington Lewis had initiated, Sarah had already designated an area of the farmhouse as a field laboratory, where extracted artifacts could be initially documented before transport to more specialized facilities. The work began with careful removal of the topsoil in the area. Directly above one of the smaller boxes, approximately 30 yards from where Sarah had made her initial discovery. Sarah observed the process with fascination, impressed by the methodical precision of the historians as they documented every aspect of their work, photographing, measuring, and recording details that would have seemed insignificant to untrained eyes. By mid-morning, the team had reached the object, a smaller version of what Sarah had discovered, approximately 10 inches in diameter and exhibiting the same copper construction with brass reinforcements. Most exciting to the historical team was the clear evidence that this box was connected to the others through what Dr. Washington Lewis described as a deliberate arrangement, suggesting a thematic organization of documents. "These aren't random artifacts, Ms. Mitchell," Dr. Washington Lewis explained as she showed Sarah the carefully extracted box. "What we're seeing is consistent with an integrated collection designed for long-term preservation and eventual discovery. The arrangement suggests these documents were organized by topic or correspondent, a systematic approach to preserving a specific historical record." As the careful extraction continued, each hour seemed to bring new discoveries that added detail to the emerging picture of Washington's hidden legacy. By afternoon, the team had recovered the smaller box and documented structural patterns that suggested a deliberately engineered preservation system rather than isolated artifacts. Most significant was the discovery that each box contained what appeared to be a different category of documents. The first box primarily holding private correspondence with key founding figures, while this new container seemed dedicated to Washington's personal reflections on the constitutional system and potential threats to its survival. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Washington Lewis said quietly as she examined the extracted box. "The organizational principles at work here suggest Washington was creating a comprehensive record of his most private thoughts about the Republic, perspectives that he may have felt were too divisive or controversial to share publicly during his lifetime. But the real question is why he buried them here, and why they were arranged in this specific pattern," added Dr. Robert Finch, the historical archaeologist overseeing the excavation. What was Washington trying to ensure would be preserved? And for whom? The possibility that the document cache might represent Washington's deliberate attempt to speak to future generations about threats or challenges to the American experiment added an entirely new dimension to the discovery. This wasn't just a collection of interesting historical documents. It could potentially represent Washington's most candid assessment of America's strengths and vulnerabilities, preserved for a time when the immediate political passions of his era had cooled. As work progressed, Dr. Washington Lewis took Sarah aside to discuss an unexpected development. Based on the quality and significance of what we're finding, several major research institutions have expressed interest in supporting a more comprehensive investigation. The American Heritage Foundation has indicated willingness to fast-track a substantial grant application, and the National Archives has reached out about establishing a permanent research facility dedicated to studying these documents. She showed Sarah proposals that outlined potential funding that dwarfed the initial compensation arrangement. This level of support would allow for a much more comprehensive approach, including specialized conservation analyses, expanded investigation areas, and most importantly from Sarah's perspective, more substantial landowner compensation and support. The financial implications were staggering. The proposed arrangements would not only resolve Sarah's immediate crisis, but potentially provide long-term stability far beyond what farming alone had offered in recent years. Yet as she reviewed the documents, Sarah found herself focused less on the financial aspects and more on the educational and preservation components outlined in the proposals. One research institute had included plans for a visitor center that would bring historians and students to learn about the discovery while contributing to the investigation. Another proposed development of educational programs for local schools, using this site to teach about the founding era and Washington's vision for America. What do you think, Ms. Mitchell? Dr. Washington Lewis asked, watching her expression as she reviewed the proposals. "It's overwhelming," she admitted. "Yesterday, I was worried about losing the farm. Today, I'm considering partnerships with major research institutions and the National Archives. Take some time to consider the options," she advised. "These are significant decisions about the future of your property. But I will say that in my experience, landowners who embrace the historical significance of their property often find it adds dimensions to their connection with the land rather than diminishing it." As the extraction team continued their careful work, Sarah walked to the far edge of the West Meadow where she could observe the activity from a distance. Maple accompanied her, the young dog seemingly content to watch the unfolding discovery she had helped initiate. From this vantage point, Sarah could see both the historians meticulously documenting Washington's hidden legacy and, in the distance, the old barn her great-grandfather had built. The juxtaposition of time frames, documents from America's founding era and her family's five-generation presence, provided a perspective that felt both humbling and somehow reassuring. She had always defined herself as a fifth-generation farmer, taking pride in continuing the Mitchell agricultural tradition. Now she found herself contemplating a new identity, custodian of what might be America's most significant cache of Washington's private thoughts, responsible for preserving and sharing a legacy that extended far beyond her family's arrival on this land. The remainder of the day brought a steady stream of discoveries from the careful extraction process, each document and feature adding detail to the picture of Washington's hidden legacy. By evening, the historical team had assembled compelling evidence that Sarah's farm contained the remains of a sophisticated document preservation system likely established by Washington himself to ensure that certain perspectives and warnings would survive beyond the partisan conflicts of his era. As the team packed up their equipment for the day, Dr. Washington Lewis provided Sarah with an updated assessment. "What we found exceeds our initial expectations," she explained. "The second box contains what appears to be Washington's private journal from 1797, with entries expressing concerns about factionalism that go far beyond his public statements. He identifies specific threats to the Republic's survival that he felt unable to address openly while president." She showed Sarah photographic evidence of the day's most significant finds, handwritten, letters marked "Most Private," and for posterity's eyes, journal entries with candid assessments of contemporaries, both famous and obscure, and most intriguingly, what appeared to be draft documents proposing constitutional amendments that were never publicly circulated. "Based on these findings, I've recommended expedited consideration for National Historic Landmark status," she continued, "which would make additional research resources available while ensuring appropriate protections for the site." After the historical team departed, promising to return the following day to continue their work, Sarah found herself once again on her porch as twilight settled over the farm. The familiar landscape now held new meaning, layered with knowledge both known and still being discovered. Her phone buzzed with messages from friends and family who had seen news reports about the discovery. The story had spread far beyond the local media, picked up by national history publications, and even gaining mention in international news. Michael had forwarded an article from a major university's American Studies department blog that described the Mitchell farm discovery as potentially revolutionary for our understanding of Washington's true vision for America's future. As darkness fell, Sarah remained on the porch, contemplating the extraordinary turn her life had taken. Just 2 days earlier, she had been a struggling farmer facing imminent foreclosure, defined primarily by her financial failures despite years of hard work and dedication. Now she found herself at the center of historical excitement, her land, suddenly valuable for reasons completely unrelated to its agricultural output. Yet amidst all the external changes, the historical activity, media attention, and financial opportunities, Sarah recognized that the most significant transformation was happening within herself. Her relationship with this land, which had been primarily economic despite her emotional attachment to her family legacy, was evolving into something more complex and ultimately more meaningful. The ground beneath her feet had potentially been chosen by Washington himself for reasons Sarah was only beginning to understand: its relationship to his nephew's property, its relative seclusion, or perhaps qualities that had made it seem likely to remain undisturbed for generations. Her own family had added another layer of connection, working the soil for generations and building the modest structures that defined the modern farm. Each Mitchell had faced challenges unique to their time: her great-great-grandfather clearing virgin forest, her grandfather weathering the Great Depression, and now Sarah finding herself writing an unexpected new chapter in that ongoing story. As stars appeared in the clear night sky, Sarah felt a strange sense of connection, not just to her direct ancestors but to Washington himself, the man whose private thoughts and concerns had lain hidden beneath her fields for over 2 centuries. The remarkable foresight required to create such a time capsule spoke of someone who understood that some truths might only be appreciated by future generations. Once immediate conflicts had faded into history. Maple stirred from her resting place near Sarah's chair, rising to press against her master's leg, as if sensing her contemplative mood. Sarah absently stroked the dog's head, grateful for the simple, loyal presence that had, against all odds, initiated this transformative discovery. "You've changed everything, clever girl," she murmured. The border collie looked up at her with knowing eyes, seemingly content with her role in uncovering secrets that had waited patiently beneath the soil for centuries. As she finally retired to bed, Sarah found herself looking forward to the morning with an anticipation she hadn't felt in years. Tomorrow would bring more discoveries, more decisions about the future of the farm, more adjustments to her understanding of her place in American history. For the first time in too long, she faced these prospects not with dread, but with genuine curiosity and excitement. The financial pressures that had defined her existence hadn't magically disappeared, but they had been transformed from insurmountable obstacles into manageable challenges. More importantly, her sense of purpose had expanded beyond mere survival. The unexpected discovery had revealed possibilities for serving as a bridge between past and future, between America's founding era and its continuing experiment in democracy, preserving evidence of Washington's private concerns while creating something sustainable for generations yet to come. As sleep finally claimed her, Sarah's last conscious thought was of Washington himself, carefully sealing documents in copper boxes for reasons modern historians could only theorize about. Had he somehow intended for them to be found centuries later, or had he simply been ensuring that certain perspectives would survive regardless of immediate political outcomes? Either way, his foresight had served a purpose not just as a historical record, but as a messenger across time, connecting citizens separated by centuries, but united by their relationship with a specific landscape that had drawn the attention of both. The morning of the central cash extraction dawned with an ethereal mist hanging over the Mitchell farm, wisps of fog curling through the ancient maple trees and obscuring the boundaries between field and forest. Sarah found the atmospheric conditions strangely appropriate, a visual reminder of how the clear divisions between past and present, between known and unknown history, had blurred since her discovery 1 week earlier. The central component of Washington's document cache, what Dr. Washington Lewis had identified as the primary repository of the system, would finally be carefully extracted today. After extensive mapping and analysis of the smaller boxes, the historical team had determined that the central unit was stable, enough to be removed safely using specialized techniques that would preserve both its structure and its contents. Sarah had spent the intervening days in a whirlwind of activity and adjustment. The historical investigation had expanded systematically across the West Meadow, revealing increasingly compelling evidence of Washington's sophisticated preservation system. Each day brought new discoveries, personal letters expressing candid opinions about key founding figures, journal entries revealing Washington's private concerns about the sustainability of the new republic, and draft documents proposing institutional safeguards that had never been publicly shared. The media attention had intensified as well. What had begun as local interest had expanded to national and even international coverage as the significance of the discoveries became apparent. Sarah had given interviews to historical journals, national newspapers, and even a documentary crew specializing in American Revolutionary history. She had carefully followed Dr. Washington Lewis's guidance about discussing the finds, emphasizing that proper understanding required scholarly analysis rather than speculation. Most significantly, Sarah's financial circumstances had undergone a dramatic transformation. The initial compensation for historical access had been supplemented by emergency preservation grants expedited by several foundations dedicated to supporting breakthrough discoveries. The Piedmont Agricultural Bank, now eager to be seen as a partner in preserving historically important sites, rather than as the villain for closing on a potential landmark, had not only restructured her mortgage but offered favorable terms that consolidated her loans and eliminated her most pressing debt. Beyond these immediate financial changes, longer-term opportunities had emerged that promised sustainable support for both the historical site and the continuing agricultural operation. Several research institutions had proposed partnerships that would bring substantial funding and educational programs to the farm. The Smithsonian had presented preliminary plans for a visitor center that would tell the interwoven stories of Washington's hidden documents and the generations of Mitchell, farmers who had unknowingly preserved the site beneath their fields. Through all these external changes, Sarah had experienced an equally profound internal transformation. Her relationship with her land had deepened immeasurably as she learned to see it through historical lenses, not just as Mitchell farmland, but as ground that had been specifically chosen by Washington himself for reasons only beginning to be understood, each generation leaving their mark in ways both visible and hidden. Now as she prepared for the central cash extraction scheduled for mid-morning at the primary site, Sarah felt a strange sense of coming full circle. The document collection that had initiated these life-changing events would finally reveal its core component, connecting her even more directly to Washington himself and the perspectives he had valued enough to preserve for future generations. Maple watched from her cushion bed near the kitchen window as Sarah dressed more formally than usual. A pressed blouse and slacks that hadn't seen use since her cousin's wedding 2 years earlier. The young dog's energy seemed to have balanced into a calm alertness since the discovery, her earlier frantic digging replaced by watchful interest in the ongoing activities. "You started all this, girl," Sarah told her, kneeling to scratch behind the dog's ears. "Wish you could come along today, but they've established clean protocols for the extraction site. I'll tell you everything when I get back." Maple's tail thumped contentedly against her cushion, her expressive eyes seeming to convey understanding beyond mere canine comprehension. The short drive to the extraction site in the West Meadow took just a few minutes, the familiar farm lanes now transformed, with temporary structures housing sophisticated historical equipment. Sarah had visited the site each day, watching as the careful preparation for today's extraction proceeded with methodical precision. Dr. Washington Lewis met her at the perimeter of the secured area, her expression reflecting both professional focus and barely contained excitement. "Ms. Mitchell, we've completed the final preparations for extracting the central repository," she explained as they walked toward the main tent structure. The imaging pattern suggests this component contains significantly more extensive documents than the peripheral boxes. It appears to be the keystone of the entire collection. The extraction site itself was a marvel of historical precision. A dome-shaped temporary structure protected the area from environmental contamination, while specialized equipment monitored everything from atmospheric conditions to soil composition. At the center, a carefully excavated pit revealed glimpses of a larger version of the copper box Sarah had first discovered, this one approximately 24 inches long and emitting a subtle patina that spoke of great age. Around the pit, approximately 15 historians in specialized protective clothing worked with quiet intensity, each focused on specific aspects of the extraction process. Instruments more advanced than anything Sarah had seen before recorded. Data streams while holographic displays showed real-time analysis of the box's condition and potential contents. The extraction team will proceed with extreme caution, Dr. Washington Lewis explained. Unlike the peripheral boxes, the central repository appears to be more complex in its construction. The imaging signatures suggest it may contain multiple compartments and possibly different types of documents. This revelation sent a shiver of both excitement and apprehension through Sarah. The idea that Washington might have created a specially designed central repository added an entirely new dimension to the discovery. "Is there any danger to the documents?" she asked, watching as the team made final preparations. "We've established multiple safeguards," Dr. Washington Lewis assured her. "The environmental control field will maintain optimal preservation conditions, and the extraction system is designed to minimize physical stress on the artifact. All evidence suggests this repository was engineered to protect its contents for centuries." With everyone in position, the lead extraction specialists signaled readiness. The team fell silent as the carefully choreographed process began. Specialized instruments extended toward the partially exposed box, taking precise measurements of its condition before the physical extraction could begin. "Remarkable," whispered one of the senior conservationists monitoring the data streams. "The preservation level is exceptional. The box appears to maintain a microclimate that has protected the contents from degradation." The extraction proceeded with exquisite care, each layer of soil removed with precision tools that disturbed the box's position as little as possible. As more of the repository became visible, its extraordinary nature became increasingly apparent. Unlike the smaller boxes, the central repository featured distinct decorative elements that had remained intact, despite centuries buried in the soil. An eagle emblem similar to but distinct from the later Great Seal, and intricate engravings of 13 stars arranged in a circular pattern. "It's interfacing perfectly with our containment system," reported one of the conservation specialists monitoring the humidity readings. "The repository seems to have been designed with remarkable foresight about preservation conditions." The possibility that they were witnessing the results of Washington's deliberate efforts to preserve critical documents for future generations sent a wave of excitement through the assembled team. Dr. Washington Lewis maintained professional composure, but Sarah could see the wonder in her eyes as she moved between monitoring stations, reviewing the incoming data. After nearly 2 hours of painstaking work, the repository was finally fully exposed, a magnificent copper chest approximately 24 inches long, 18 inches wide, and 12 inches deep, with brass reinforcements at the corners and an intricate locking mechanism that had remained intact despite centuries buried in the soil. Its surface was covered with elaborate engravings, including quotes in Latin that one of the historians immediately recognized as Cicero's writings on the responsibilities of citizenship. "We're ready for transfer to the containment unit," announced the lead extraction specialist. With practiced precision, the team activated a specialized transport system that would move the repository into an environmentally controlled containment unit without disrupting its internal conditions. As the repository was carefully lifted from the soil that had surrounded it for over 2 centuries, something unexpected happened. The sunlight caught the brass components of the lock mechanism, revealing an inscription that had been hidden by soil accretion. "When faction threatens, truth must hide until wisdom prevails." "That's Washington's personal motto," one of the historians exclaimed. "It appears in private correspondence, but was never used publicly." This confirms his direct involvement in creating this preservation system. As the repository was secured in its containment unit, Dr. Washington Lewis approached it with visible reverence, carefully examining the inscription and decorative elements now fully revealed by the cleaning process. "The craftsmanship is extraordinary," she said quietly. "This isn't merely functional, it's a deliberate artistic statement about preservation and posterity." Washington clearly intended this collection to speak across generations. As the historical team transported the contained repository to the field laboratory for more detailed analysis, Sarah found herself walking slightly apart, trying to process the extraordinary events she had just witnessed. What had begun as a simple farmer's accidental discovery had evolved into the potential recovery of Washington's most private thoughts about America's experiment in self-governance, perspectives deliberately preserved for a time when they might be appreciated without the immediate political passions of his era. In the field laboratory, the repository continued to yield revelations as the conservation team began its careful assessment. Non-invasive scanning revealed multiple compartments within the chest, each apparently containing different categories of documents. "Ms. Mitchell," Dr. Washington Lewis said, approaching her after consulting with several specialists, "the repository appears to contain a comprehensive collection of Washington's most private papers. The organizational system is remarkable. Documents separated by correspondent, by topic, and by sensitivity level. What do you think he was trying to preserve?" Sarah asked, fascinated by the shifting images on the scanning displays. "Based on what we've seen so far in the peripheral boxes, I believe Washington was creating a time capsule of perspectives he felt were too divisive or potentially dangerous to share in his own era," Dr. Washington Lewis explained. "The documents we've already examined include warnings about specific threats to democratic governance that remain strikingly relevant today: the dangers of factionalism, foreign interference in domestic politics, and the corrosive effect of personal ambition on public service." She guided Sarah to a monitoring station where a specialist was recording the preliminary scan results. "This compartment appears to contain personal correspondence with John Adams discussing their shared concerns about partisan divisions," the specialist explained, pointing to a section of the scan. "Based on the dating and context, these would be letters written during the growing Federalist-Republican split that Washington found so troubling." The thought was both thrilling and humbling. They might be looking at Washington's most candid assessment of challenges to the American experiment, perspectives deemed too volatile for his contemporaries but preserved for future citizens who might face similar challenges. As the day progressed, the non-invasive analysis became increasingly sophisticated. The conservation team was able to generate preliminary images of several documents without opening the repository, revealing tantalizing glimpses of Washington's handwriting and official seals from various founding figures. By late afternoon, a preliminary translation protocol had been established, allowing the historians to identify specific document types and potential content areas without compromising the preservation environment. The breakthrough came when the imaging system revealed a document that unmistakably appeared to be in Washington's hand, titled "Reflections on the Republic's Future Challenges," and dated December 1797, just 2 years before his death. "This appears to be a comprehensive analysis of threats to the constitutional system," explained the linguistic specialist who had been working on the document identification. "Based on the visible portions, Washington is addressing future readers directly, explaining why he felt these perspectives needed to be preserved separate from his public papers." This was extraordinary, not just historical documents, but a deliberate message across time, from the first president to future generations of Americans. The implications were profound, suggesting that Washington had recognized challenges to the Republic that he felt unable to address openly in his own time. The formal briefing held later that evening gathered all the primary researchers to share their preliminary findings and coordinate next steps. Sarah was included not just as the property owner, but as an honored participant whose discovery had initiated this potential revolution in historical understanding. Based on today's extraction and initial analysis, Dr. Washington Lewis began. Addressing the assembled team, we appear to be dealing with a sophisticated time capsule, created by Washington himself during the final years of his life. The system was deliberately buried here in 1797, based on preliminary dating of the surrounding soil layers and the documents themselves. She displayed holographic representations of the repository layout and document organization as she continued. The technology utilizes preservation principles far beyond what was commonly practiced in the 18th century, but consistent with specialized techniques Washington might have learned through his connections with scientific figures of his era. It appears capable of maintaining stable humidity levels, protection from light degradation, and resistance to environmental contaminants. Most significantly, she explained, the collection appeared to be thematically organized around specific threats to the American experiment that Washington had identified, but felt unable to address openly: partisan factionalism, foreign interference in domestic affairs, the corrupting influence of financial speculation on governance, and the fragility of civic virtue in the face of material temptation. The implications were profound, fundamentally challenging previous historical understanding of Washington's public reticence on certain issues. The discovery suggested that rather than simply avoiding controversial topics, he had created a sophisticated preservation system to ensure his perspectives would survive for future generations who might face similar challenges. The sleek, curved dome of the research wing complemented rather than competed with the classic lines of the original farmhouse and barn. Dr. Washington Lewis stood beside her at the podium, along with Dr. Hamilton from the National Archives and Ambassador Carolyn Rodriguez from the newly formed National Commission for Historical Preservation. Behind them, carefully tended fields stretched toward the horizon, the working farm continuing its agricultural tradition, even as historical research proceeded in specifically designated areas. "This place has always been special," Sarah began, looking out at the assembled guests, "though for most of my life I didn't fully understand why. For 5 generations, my family worked this soil, following the rhythms of planting and harvest, struggling against weather and economics, finding meaning in the daily stewardship of this land." She gestured toward the West Meadow, where specialized research facilities now protected Washington's document cache while allowing controlled scholarly access. "What we've discovered in recent months is that this connection extends much further back than the Mitchell family to 1797, when George Washington himself recognized something significant about this specific place, something worth establishing. A preservation system that would connect him to future generations of Americans in ways we're only beginning to understand. The central repository that had started this extraordinary journey was now the centerpiece of the Heritage Center's main exhibit, displayed in a specialized conservation environment alongside holographic representations of selected documents, and the historical context that had prompted Washington to create such an elaborate time capsule. The facility combined public education spaces with secured research areas where historians from around the country collaborated to understand Washington's private thoughts and how they might inform contemporary understanding of American democracy. Most remarkable was how the ongoing historical work had transformed rather than disrupted the agricultural operation. With careful planning and generous support from the National Partnership, Sarah had implemented innovative sustainable farming practices on the portions of her land not designated for historical research. The Heritage Center included educational programs on both traditional American agriculture and the evolution of farming practices from Washington's era to the present day. What we're creating here is not simply a research facility or a working farm, Sarah continued, but a place where different ways of knowing and valuing America's heritage can inform each other. Washington understood our nation through the lens of a founding visionary concerned about the Republic's future. My family knew this land through generations of practical agricultural knowledge, passed from parent to child. Modern historical research brings yet another perspective through collaborative investigation and shared discovery. As she spoke, Sarah noticed Maple sitting contentedly near the front row, the young border collie having earned a special place of honor at all official events. Though still youthful and energetic, she carried herself with a new dignity, as if aware of her role in this unfolding story. Local children who visited the center particularly loved hearing the story of the dog, who had sensed Washington's hidden legacy beneath the soil. None of these perspectives is complete on its own, Sarah concluded, but together they create something profound, a deeper understanding of our national journey that's rooted in both scholarly analysis and lived experience. That's the true treasure we've uncovered here, not just extraordinary historical documents, however significant, but a renewed awareness of how past, present, and future link through our shared stewardship of the American experiment. As the formal ceremony concluded and the gathered crowd dispersed to tour the facilities and view the ongoing research, Sarah found a quiet moment alone on the porch of the farmhouse that remained her home despite all the changes around it. From this familiar vantage point, she could see both the Heritage Center with its excited visitors and the productive fields where crops continued to grow under her care. The financial struggles that had once threatened to end the Mitchell farming legacy had been resolved through the partnership with historical institutions and national heritage organizations. More importantly, the farm had found a new purpose that honored both its connection to Washington and its agricultural tradition, becoming a place where multiple forms of knowledge and value could coexist and enrich each other. Maple joined her on the wooden porch, the faithful companion who had initiated this extraordinary journey, now content to rest in the afternoon sun. Sarah reached down to scratch behind the dog's ears, filled with gratitude for the mysterious canine intuition that had led them both to a discovery that transformed not just their circumstances, but potentially the nation's understanding of its founding vision. "You changed everything, clever girl," Sarah said softly. Maple looked up at her with those wise, expressive eyes that had always seemed to see more than ordinary canine vision should permit. In that gaze, Sarah felt a connection not just to her faithful companion, but to all those who had been drawn to this land. Across centuries, Washington, with his concerns for America's future, the generations of farmers who had unknowingly preserved his legacy, and now the historians who sought to understand its significance. As visitors explored the Heritage Center and researchers carefully studied Washington's documents, Sarah knew that the true treasure wasn't simply historical artifacts, however significant. It was the continuing relationship between Americans and their shared history, the conversations across time that helped citizens understand both where they had come from and where they might be going. That story continued through her now, transformed but unbroken, connecting America's founding vision to its contemporary challenges through shared exploration of a democratic experiment more wondrous and fragile than anyone had imagined. 1 year after the discovery that had transformed her life, Sarah Mitchell stood at the edge of the newly harvested East Field, watching as the autumn sun cast long shadows across land that had sustained her family for generations. The crisp October air carried the scent of freshly turned soil, a fragrance as familiar to her as her own heartbeat, yet now laden with deeper meaning. This wasn't just dirt. It was the keeper of American heritage, the preserver of connections. Across centuries, the Mitchell Farm Presidential Heritage and Agricultural Center had just celebrated its first anniversary, marking 12 extraordinary months of growth, discovery, and unexpected harmony between seemingly disparate worlds. What had begun as a desperate farmer's accidental find while plowing had blossomed into something none could have predicted: an internationally recognized center for collaborative research that bridged founding-era insights, historical scholarship, and sustainable agriculture. "Beautiful evening," remarked Dr. Washington Lewis, joining Sarah at the field's edge. After a year of close collaboration, their initial formal relationship had evolved into genuine friendship and mutual respect. "The heritage grain harvest looks exceptional this year." Sarah nodded, gesturing toward the eastern field where specialized crop varieties had been grown, using a combination of traditional techniques and insights gained from historical research into Washington-era agricultural practices. "The sustainable methods the research team helped develop have produced better yields than I would have believed possible without chemical interventions. We'll have plenty for both the educational programs and commercial sales." Her agricultural operation had been transformed as dramatically as the historical landscape. Rather than fighting a losing battle against corporate-scale production with conventional crops, the Mitchell farm had pivoted to heritage varieties, grown using methods informed by both traditional knowledge and the extraordinary insights provided by Washington's own agricultural journals, which had been part of the document cache. The unique produce commanded premium prices at specialty markets, while the educational component created additional revenue streams that had placed the farm on solid financial footing for the first time in decades. The conservation team is documenting remarkable connections between Washington's agricultural philosophy and modern sustainability principles, Dr. Washington Lewis noted. "The combination of your practical farming wisdom with insights from Washington's private papers is creating educational materials that could revolutionize how we teach agricultural history nationwide." Sarah smiled at the thought. Each generation of Mitchells had farmed according to the best knowledge of their time, passing land and wisdom from parent to child. Now that chain of knowledge had been expanded dramatically, reaching across historical periods to incorporate advanced understanding of American agricultural development that had been patiently documented by Washington himself over 2 centuries ago. They walked together along the farm's central path, a route now traveled daily by researchers, students, and visitors from across the country. The weathered barn had been carefully restored to serve as an exhibition space where visitors could view both the working agricultural operation and the West Meadow Research Area, understanding how the two complementary aspects of the Mitchell Farm Heritage Center coexisted in productive harmony. The Presidential Scholars Delegation completed their tour yesterday, Sarah mentioned. They're featuring our site in their documentary series on Washington's vision for American democracy. The director said our center offers the most compelling blend of historical research and practical application they've encountered. Dr. Washington Lewis nodded, unsurprised. "What we've discovered here continues to expand our understanding of Washington's foresight. The journals and letters have provided insights into his concerns about democratic fragility that our top historical scholars estimate would have fundamentally altered our understanding of the founding era had they been known earlier." The historical investigation had proceeded methodically throughout the year, each careful analysis revealing new aspects of Washington's hidden legacy and its implications for understanding early American history. The central repository had contained not just personal correspondence, but explicit messages to future generations, gradually establishing a more nuanced picture of Washington's private concerns about the challenges facing the young republic. Most recently, the conservation team had uncovered what appeared to be Washington's draft proposals for additional constitutional safeguards, institutional protections against partisan factionalism and foreign interference that he had ultimately decided not to share publicly due to the heated political climate of his final years. As they approached the Heritage Center building, constructed with architecture that honored both traditional farm design and the elegant symmetry evident in Washington's personal aesthetic, Sarah spotted a familiar figure sitting on a bench in the late afternoon sun. Maple, now 4 years old, had become something of a celebrity at the center. The young border collie held an honored position both as the initiator of the discovery and as a beloved ambassador who greeted visitors with dignified cordiality. The congressional delegation for tomorrow's symposium has all arrived. Dr. Washington Lewis informed Sarah as they entered the center's main building. The integration of Washington's concerns about partisan division with contemporary challenges to democratic governance has drawn significant bipartisan interest. Your keynote address on balanced stewardship is scheduled for 10 o'clock a.m. Sarah nodded, still slightly amazed that she, a fifth-generation farmer who had once faced imminent foreclosure, was now invited to address national leaders and contribute to historical publications. Her practical wisdom and authentic connection to the land, combined with her unique role as the discoverer of Washington's hidden legacy, had positioned her as a valuable bridge between different ways of knowing and experiencing American democracy. Inside the Heritage Center, the main exhibition hall buzzed with activity as staff prepared for the next day's symposium, arranging chairs in a semicircular pattern that honored the democratic principles evident in Washington's writings while accommodating modern presentation technology. The contained central repository had been positioned prominently behind a specialized barrier, its elegant copper surfaces creating a mesmerizing backdrop that reminded participants of the extraordinary historical connection that had initiated their gathering. As attendees began to arrive, distinguished professors in business casual attire, government officials in formal dress, agricultural specialists in practical field clothing, Sarah was struck by the unlikely community that had formed around this place. People who might never have crossed paths in conventional contexts now engaged in genuine dialogue, each bringing valuable perspective to shared questions about America's democratic experiment. Dr. Washington Lewis approached. Accompanied by a distinguished visitor, Sarah immediately recognized Dr. Eleanor Franklin, director of the American Historical Association and one of the world's foremost authorities on Washington's presidency. The renowned historian had traveled specifically to see the Mitchell farm site and participate in the symposium. "Ms. Mitchell," Dr. Franklin greeted her warmly, "it's an honor to finally meet you. Your approach to integrating historical discovery with continuing agricultural practice represents exactly the kind of balanced stewardship Washington himself advocated in his private writings about American land management." "The honor is mine," Sarah replied sincerely. "I'm just a farmer who stumbled onto something extraordinary. The collaborative model we've developed here has been a true team effort." Dr. Franklin smiled appreciatively. "That modesty is part of what makes this place special. Too often significant historical discoveries become disconnected from living communities and practical wisdom. What you've created here, this dialogue between past and present, between different ways of knowing America, offers a template for how we might approach our understanding of national heritage in more inclusive ways." As the symposium officially began, Ambassador Rodriguez offered a welcome acknowledging the historic nature of their gathering. The first national conference centered around Washington's private vision for America's democratic future. The semicircular seating arrangement fostered a sense of equality among participants, regardless of academic credentials or institutional affiliation. When it came time for Sarah's keynote address, she spoke not from a formal podium, but while standing in the center of the semicircle, occasionally gesturing toward the elegant copper repository or the fields visible through the Heritage Center's large windows. Her presentation, titled "Democratic Cultivation: Bridging Washington's Vision and America's Future," wove together the extraordinary historical discoveries, practical agricultural applications, and profound democratic implications of Washington's hidden legacy into a compelling vision of America's potential path forward. What we've discovered here isn't just historical documents. she explained, gesturing toward the central repository with its intricate engravings. It's a reminder that democracy requires cultivation, patient attention, long-term thinking, respect for the complex interdependencies that sustain both soil and society. Washington invested in creating this preservation system because he understood that some truths need time to germinate, protected from the immediate storms of partisan conflict. She described how the integration of insights from Washington's agricultural journals with traditional farming wisdom had transformed her struggling conventional farm into a thriving operation, producing heritage crops while actually regenerating soil health. The documents had revealed Washington's sophisticated understanding of sustainable land management, practices he had explored on his own farms, but that had been largely forgotten in the industrialization of American agriculture. My great-great-grandfather cleared this land using horses and hand tools, seeing himself as pioneering new agricultural approaches, Sarah continued. Now I understand that he was actually operating within a much longer conversation about American stewardship, a landscape that had been carefully studied by Washington himself, who recognized something precious about this country's natural abundance, long before corporate agriculture transformed our relationship with the land. Most compelling was her description of how the discovery had transformed her personal understanding of democratic citizenship. What had begun as a desperate struggle to save her family farm from foreclosure had evolved into a deeper commitment to fostering connection between America's founding vision and its contemporary challenges. A year ago, I defined success narrowly as keeping this land in my family, continuing the Mitchell farming tradition for one more generation, she acknowledged. Now I understand that true stewardship is both humbler and more ambitious, recognizing ourselves as one link in a longer chain of democratic cultivation, responsible for preserving not just our own traditions, but the possibility of connection with those who planted the seeds of this republic and those who will inherit its harvest long after we're gone. As Sarah concluded her address, the assembled historians, government officials, and agricultural specialists responded with sustained applause, recognizing the authentic wisdom of someone whose perspective had been shaped by both practical experience and profound historical revelation. In academic contexts, often characterized by specialized knowledge and theoretical language, the Mitchell Farm Heritage Center had become a rare space where different approaches to understanding America's democratic experiment could engage in productive dialogue. The symposium continued throughout the day, with presentations ranging from detailed textual analysis of Washington's private papers to agricultural applications of his land management principles, from communication theory to philosophical implications for contemporary governance. What united these diverse contributions was a shared commitment to understanding how thoughtful citizens had engaged with American democracy across generations of challenge and renewal. During the afternoon break, Sarah stepped outside for a moment of quiet reflection. The Heritage Center grounds were now a carefully designed landscape that honored both the historical significance of Washington's hidden legacy and the continuing agricultural tradition of the Mitchell farm. Visitors could explore interactive displays explaining the founding era's democratic principles, observe sustainable farming techniques informed by Washington's journals, and contemplate America's ongoing experiment in self-governance. Maple joined her, the faithful companion who had initiated this extraordinary journey, now content to rest in the autumn sunshine. Sarah knelt to scratch behind the dog's ears, overcome with gratitude for the mysterious canine perception that had changed everything. "You saw what generations of humans missed, clever girl," she said softly. The border collie looked up at her with those intelligent eyes that had always seemed to perceive more than ordinary canine vision should permit. In that gaze, Sarah felt connection not just to her loyal companion, but to all forms of wisdom that had been drawn to this specific piece of American soil. Washington, with his concerns for the Republic's future, the generations of farmers who had unknowingly preserved his legacy, And now the historians and citizens seeking to understand its significance for contemporary democracy. Looking up at the clear blue Virginia sky, Sarah realized that somewhere out there, perhaps in whatever afterlife might exist for America's founding figures, Washington himself might be observing the fruits of his foresight, might be contemplating the curious fact that a struggling farmer and her faithful dog would someday uncover the legacy he had so carefully preserved, might be considering the possibility that his most private concerns and hopes for the Republic would finally find receptive ears now that Americans had weathered 2 centuries of democratic experimentation. The thought filled her not with intimidation, but with profound responsibility. The recognition that citizenship in a democratic republic was not simply a status, but an ongoing obligation. That the American experiment required constant cultivation by those willing to look beyond immediate self-interest toward the longer horizon of collective flourishing. As Sarah Mitchell, farmer, discoverer, democratic citizen, returned to the symposium to continue learning from America's brightest minds about the Washington legacy Maple had helped uncover, she carried with her a vision of possibility that transcended the financial worries that had once defined her existence. The true treasure wasn't simply historical documents, however significant, but the recognition that democracy required continual renewal through thoughtful stewardship and honest conversation across generations. The struggling farm that had nearly broken her had ultimately offered America a profound gift: the recovery of Washington's most private reflections on the fragility and promise of democratic governance. In that extraordinary revelation lay hope not just for Sarah Mitchell and her family legacy, but for all Americans as they confronted challenges Washington himself had anticipated over 2 centuries earlier, yet had the wisdom and foresight to address through a remarkable act of democratic faith, preserving his insights for a time when citizens might be ready to hear them. Sarah had discovered much more than copper boxes buried in her field. She had uncovered the living heart of American democracy, the conviction that ordinary citizens, armed with both practical wisdom and historical perspective, might continue the extraordinary experiment in self-governance that Washington had helped initiate, but knew would require endless cultivation by generations yet unborn. Her farm had become not just a heritage site, but a proving ground for democratic renewal, a place where past and present engaged in the collaborative work of cultivating America's future. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.